Hey everyone, sorry about that long opening there. I was actually getting ready to just go ahead and hit it, and I saw that my camera was like really far off from where it needed to be, so I'm not gonna do another take. I've already done like 3 takes of this. How's it going? It's me, Scott. Welcome to another episode of Heroic Studios Gaming. I have changed up a few things. I am now on my laptop because my replacement desktop thing was not doing very good, and I turned into, well, it looked like I was remaking it like a Max Headroom video or something. It was like all shaky and kind of like twitchy and stuff. It was weird. But so now I'm running on this laptop, and I changed things up a little bit. I made some of the icons over there a little bit better, and then I made instead of putting my Discord, I put the website over here. So that's what kind of the changes I did. And I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I kept the music right, but we'll see. Anyway, let's start today's Scott's Book Corner. And then today I'm going to be talking about the second book in the Lone Wolf series, the book Fire on the Water. This image on here does match the book, but I feel like it matches the next one better. But that's not. I didn't. I wasn't the art director, so I didn't choose those things. But anyway, this book is different from the first book, which you guys may remember is Flight from the Dark. In this book, it actually kind of starts things off going a little bit differently than. Well, I mean, first off, you have a quest. So unlike the first one, which was basically you're just trying to survive the day, as it were, and trying to get to Holmgard to let them know that all the Kai had died and you were the last remaining lone wolf of the monastery. This one's actually a quest because the Dark Lords are rising. The king of the Summerlanden king in Holmgard, he basically says, "Look, you're going to need the Summer Sword, or Sommerswerd, as I read it as a kid, because it's SOMMERSWERD." I don't know, because it's a fantasy story, and Joe Deaver wanted to make it exotic, I guess. So, but if you read it out loud, it sounds like Summer Sword, and that's what I think it's intended to be. But it's essentially this sword of light, right? And so the king tells you that you have to go get it because there's this complicated history and politics going on with the kings of Summerland and the kings of a kingdom called Duranor. And Duranor is the neighboring kingdom, and the idea was that back in the day, Duranor and Summerland teamed up together to help to stop the Dark Lords. And so when it was all said and done, Summerland gave the Summer Sword to Duranor to hold on to for safekeeping, based on the idea that eventually, if the Dark Lords ever rose again, they would get it back from Duranor and give it to the Kai so that they could bring down the Dark Lords. And the Kai primarily live in Summerland. The Kai monastery is at least in Summerland. So it makes sense that there's this sort of weird, convoluted, complex political system. And this book actually sort of there's a little bit of intrigue that goes on in this one. So there's a little bit more bureaucracy and things that happen. In fact, there isn't any in the first book. In this one, there is. So this one does sort of match the sort of political system that I'm mentioning a little bit better. But yeah, so the book is essentially about your quest to get the Summer Sword from the Kingdom of Duranor and all of the stuff that happens along the way, including, but not limited to, a couple of times when you're on boats on the water and everything goes horribly, horribly wrong. It sort of sticks to the tradition of anyone who's played like Dungeons & Dragons and played on the water. Like, water in Dungeons & Dragons is terrible, and don't do it unless you can breathe underwater. Otherwise, you're probably going to die. Because your ship can be attacked at any point, and if you get pulled underwater, well, you're going to die. And that's kind of how it goes here in this story as well. There's a couple of times we're on boats, and it never really works out for your character. But the one thing about this book, the one thing that's really frustrating to me, I actually had to restart it a couple of times. I've actually run through it now like 10 times in the last couple of days because I died a bunch. I had to restart so many times. So I made a character that I was using to go through the books again for these videos. And that version of Lone Wolf, unfortunately, had a fairly low combat skill. I got a 3, so I had like a combat skill of 13. Which isn't super great. Even when you have like these sort of buffs a little bit later, it's still kind of terrible. And in this book, it specifically sets you up to lose all of your gear. Like, no matter what choice you make, no matter what choices you make, you essentially either, at some point, there's a point in the story, there's like this sort of like bottleneck moment where you either lose some of your gear and you get to keep the special items, like the thing you need to complete your mission for the book, that specifically the Seal of Hammerdal, which is given to you at the very beginning, and you need that to get the Summer Sword from the king. You either lose everything, including your special items, or you lose just your backpack and weapons. And so you're sort of handicapped through a portion of the story. In fact, there are ways, I guess right after that, there are a few ways if you make some seriously right decisions to like get weapons back. But for the most part, you're essentially unarmed for a lot of the combats that happen later. Which in this book means, or which in this game system means that you have a -4 to your combat skill. So I started off with a 13, and then the book automatically drops me down to 9 for a few combats, which meant I died a bunch. So eventually, after getting frustrated from dying so many times in this, like, because of the situation that the game forces me into, my wife was like, "Why don't you just make a new character and start over?" And so I made a new character, but instead of starting over with this book, I started over actually with the first book, and I just started over again. In fact, I made 2 new characters, one with a combat skill of 17, and one with a 19, and I'm seeing how they play out differently, because the one with the 17 also had maximum endurance points, so that kind of helps. And the other one that had a 19 actually only had 23 endurance points, which is kind of low. So I'm trying to play out to see which is better, actually, to give you as a synopsis or sort of a review on whether having a higher combat skill or having a higher endurance actually works out for you in the long run a little bit better. So anyway, I ended up more of the story, and both of them have gone through the second book, but I recreated them because I got tired of losing, and the one with the 17 actually died a couple of times because there's also some choices in this book where you just automatically die. Like, you have to choose right or left on like a fork in the road, and it doesn't really give you anything to work with, so you're like right or left. You choose one, and it's like instant death. Cool, right? And so like it's like a weird... Sometimes there's these weird decisions like that, and it's like, okay, well, that didn't help me at all. I had to choose right. So now I've got to go back and go the other way. And if you're doing it through the app, right, this is what I discovered. If you're doing it through the app, you have to start the whole book over. Unlike when you do it with the actual book, where you can just like hold your fingers, because like I read them like this a lot, where I'm like reading it like where I've got a couple of pages held, and I'm like holding it open when I've got a couple of pages like being held in my fingers or something like this. Let me show you. This is a common one for me, something like that, where I'm holding a couple of decisions back so that I can just go, that was a bad idea, and go back, like that kind of thing. So you can't do that if you don't have the book. You have to. The app just forces you to restart, because I did it a couple of times. Like when so the one that I made with the 19 is on the app, and so I'm doing it there. But I went the 17 in the book, so I have you have to start over. Which sucks, but anyway, this book is, so there's a little bit of frustration there, because there's a couple points where, like, if you've had everything taken and you don't make the choices to get the right choices to get to the path where you get some of it back, you end up with like no gold, and like that means that so after the whole water thing, and after like you get bottlenecked and you have to make choices that lose all of your stuff, you then have another choice where you can like take like a coach and a cart in like over the land into the town of Port Bax that you're trying to get to, or on foot, because you don't have the ability to pay for it. And if you go on foot, it's like infinitely more complicated than taking the cart. So if you've already been screwed and like you don't have any of your stuff, then you're screwed again, and you just die, and you have to start over and do the book over again. So it's kind of lame in that regard. Like, it's like, it kind of like, if you make the wrong choice, like you get stuck where you have to choose one or the other. And then after that, if you make a couple of wrong choices, you're basically boned. It's not an enjoyable story. It's not an enjoyable book, and you just kind of want to move on and forget that you even did it. But if you make the right choices, you eventually can get some of your stuff back, or in the case of me, where I discovered that a certain choice puts you down by the docks with some 3 shady guys who tried to mug you, and instead you can beat them down and steal their stuff. And then I ended up with weapons again, and then I was back on board with doing the thing that I needed to do. But yeah, and then there's some choices about like choosing. There's like some clues that aren't very well laid for like a conspiracy against you, and so like in the very beginning of the book, you don't have a choice. You get thrown into a fight like automatically. You get attacked by some thugs on the harbor right in the beginning of the book. Later on, that becomes important, because later on there's a choice you have to make, and the only hint you're given is a matching characteristic to the thugs on the docks to somebody that is amongst the group of people that you have to choose, and that clue is supposed to be enough to spur your character into determining which of them is like a traitor and is trying to kill you. which is fine. But it's not super strong. So if you forgot that there was this mention of this characteristic, then you wouldn't realize, because then in the second part, it's just like a sort of passing mention that there's a similar characteristic as it goes through everyone else. So it's kind of like a weird choice. There's a few choices in there that actually have like pretty heavy response to the way the story plays out, and yet they're not really well set up. So you just kind of hope for the best when you make a choice. And like I said, sometimes you end up insta-death, right? Funny story, the character I made with the Combat 19, I decided to, in every other case, when it came to the decision on the traitor, then you followed up by, like, they call the guards, when you decide to, like, point out who the traitor is, before you can really explain yourself. And you have to choose to stay and fight them or run away. I often ran away, but with the character that had a combat skill of 19, I was just like, well, screw it, I'm going to fight him. And I won. I won because the first 3 were insta-kills. So I was like, hey, all right. So then I ended up losing like half of my health in the fight with the other 2, but like the first 3 just dropped. So the town's guard meant nothing. But then I'm left just this pile of dead bodies back in a tavern when I leave the town, and it's like, is that really the image of a Kai, right? But whatever. It's like those kinds of things don't have a prolonged impact on the later story, even though they should. In a role-playing game, they would, because the game master would probably throw back on, like, they're looking for this person that killed all these people in this tavern a little while back. But anyway, so the story goes on, and it's pretty good. You eventually get to where you need to get to, but getting the Summer Sword, interestingly enough, is not the end of the story. It's like you do all this stuff to finally get there, and you think it's going to be the end, but it's not. And then you start traveling back, and then stuff starts happening to you on the road, in which you, it's actually on the river, because they put you back on boats again. But when you're on the water again, you get attacked by ghost ships, and the ghost ships are being led by none other than Vonatar the Traitor, which is what the cover of this is, right? But then there's like, in the very next book, you get into a fight with him at the very end, like a boss battle, and it's actually a lot more epic. But in this case, yeah, you end up like jumping ships. There's this ship jumping thing you can do, and you can either like jump into the water and swim and do all these things in the water, and hopefully not get killed by something in the water, which totally happens. You get attacked by a thing in the water, or you can just try jumping from burning ship to burning ship and mowing down things along the way with your super cool special sword that you've got. And then at the very end, the Vonatar the Traitor gets away, but you end up back in Homeguard just in time to see that the Dark Lords have sent a whole bunch of like Helghast and Drakim to go destroy the land, and here you show up with the sword of power, essentially, and He-Man, I have the power kind of moment, your way to victory at the very end of the book. The ending of the book is kind of lame in that way. Like, it actually could be a lot better, but they spent the whole book explaining how you got the sword, and so like the end just kind of feels like they're like, all right, here's the conclusion of the story. But fortunately, you get to keep the Summer Sword from that point forward, and so you get to use it in many creative ways in later books. In fact, in this book establishes essentially all of the story from this point forward. So the first book it's sort of standalone thing and doesn't matter. This book does matter if you're going to play all the rest of them in the future, because this does establish some later stuff. Like, this book introduces you to the Summer Sword and its importance throughout the rest of the story, but then also introduces you to Helghast, which are a type of monster that come out that are servants of the Dark Lords, that are not quite the Dark Lords, but it have some of their power to the point where they can only be injured by magical weapons, i.e. the Summer Sword, and a magical spear, which shows up in the story, that you can either keep or give to the captain or some of the guards of Durinor to try to defend the country, essentially, from the onslaught of the Dark Lord's minions through this particular pass. It doesn't work out for him, so spoiler, don't give him the spear because you won't get it back. But if you do keep the spear, then you can use it later on, and it's useful against things like Helghasts and other things that are immune to stuff that isn't magic weapons. But it's not tremendously important because you get the Summer Sword at the end of this book, so the spear is only useful up until the end of the book when you encounter those things in the book prior to getting the Summer Sword. After you have the Summer Sword, doesn't matter, because you have the Summer Sword, and the Summer Sword's better anyway. It's a magic weapon that does magical stuff, but then does all these crazy things plot-wise through like later books where it just does stuff like beams of light kill things or whatever. But then the other thing it does is it automatically bumps your combat skill up by 8, I think. So But the character that is 19 is now 27 because I'm going to start using the summer sword all the time. And if I happen to get weapon skill and it happens to be swords, then I will also get that as well. So that's another 2, which puts me at then would put me at 29, which is pretty well good enough to get me through the rest of them without any kind of increases, because up until about book 14, everything that I encounter is not going to have anything over 20 as far as its skill, so I'm already going to be like 9 or so above, which means insta-kills are an option. They're on the table for insta-killing like Hellguests and stuff, which is pretty cool. But anyway, so this book is really good to establish the rest of the lore, and this was a 15-minute video that didn't need to be 15 minutes. I give it 1 thumb up, only 1, because there is these sort of frustrating bottlenecks that I have not encountered any outside of this book. The later books, almost always when there's like a decision to make, there's not usually a bottleneck decision where you lose everything. It's like in this case, what I mean by this is that no matter which option you have, no matter which option you take, none of them lead to you getting to keep your stuff. All of them lead to you losing your stuff. I know because I tried them through, but then I also looked up other discussions on it, and everyone has pointed out that when you break down the tree, no decision at any point in this particular point in the story lets you keep everything. You have to lose at least half of your stuff at the bare minimum. That's the option. In every other case where that sort of thing happens in the later books, there's usually one of the options where you can squeak by with keeping your stuff. Now there are points where you might you might like lose some of your stuff. Some of your stuff might come out of your pack or whatever, which happens later in the one of the books. I can't remember. I think it's the next one, book 3. You lose like your stuff, and no, it's in book. Anyway, there's a point in I think it's the next book where there's a point where you lose all of your stuff. And or you lose most of your stuff, you lose the stuff out of your backpack. That sort of happens, but you don't lose your weapons. You just lose like the meals and things that you have in your backpack. So like these kinds of things occur in the books, but it's like one option. There were 3 options. If you take one of them, it leads you down a path where there are other options, and then there's one option that's like jump in the river to escape. If you do that, you lose everything from your pack, right? But all the other options that have led up to that point don't get you to that point. In this book, none of the options you take once you're on the boat, which is you're basically forced on the boat at some point. Once you're on the boat, you're going to lose your stuff. Like you have no options after that. So, yeah, so that's what I mean. So anyway, that's it. So 1 thumb up. I would give it 2, but that's just rough. And so that's it. So this is a very long video for a very short book. In fact, I could have just read you the whole book in this time. It's very short. But anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys have a good time, and I hope that you actually enjoy these books. Like I said, there's some choices. I'm not going to spoil all the choices. There are just some choices in this book that suck. But I'll talk about the next book next time, unless you guys want me to talk about something else. You're going to have to message me, otherwise I'm just going to keep going down the chain and just keep up making these videos about this same particular series. So anyway, see you later.